By June 9th, 1973, things had taken a drastic turn for Michelle Sharon. She'd already moved from the United Kingdom to Adelaide, Australia with her parents. She made a new life for herself and settled down to start her own family with a man named John Sharon, who was more commonly known as Barry to his friends and family. But things between the couple grew more and more difficult as time went on because Barry suffered from a series of mental health issues that only continued to grow worse and more severe, and things became more serious. With the arrival of their son, Darren Jason Sharon, who was more commonly known as Jason, Michelle came to realise that Barry's mental health issues were putting their child's safety at risk, and she decided to move out of the home they shared together. Michelle moved back into her family home to live with her parents, taking baby Jason with her, who was only 11 months old at the time, and taking a step back from her husband to focus on providing a good life for her son. Despite this, Barry was still involved in Jason's life. He would visit him under the supervision of Michelle and her parents, and it was during one of these supervised visits that Barry would do something that would leave the family reeling for almost half a decade. On June 9th of 1973, Barry showed up to Michelle's family home to see his son, spending time with Jason whilst his grandparents kept a close eye to make sure nothing bad happened. Barry saw his son and left without doing anything particularly unusual, but just a few hours later, Barry would come back to the home. This immediately put Michelle's parents on edge, as it was incredibly unusual for Barry to come back to the home more than once in the same day, and Michelle wasn't there to keep an eye on him or to monitor how he behaved and interacted with their son. When Barry returned that evening, he walked back into the home, going to the lounge where baby Jason was, and then he bundled the child up in his arms and started running. Michelle's father immediately chased after him, desperately trying to catch Barry before he could make it back to his car, but unfortunately he wasn't fast enough. Realising that nothing good could come from Barry getting away with the baby, Michelle's father jumped into his own car and started to follow Barry as he tore down the streets. But he unfortunately lost sight of Barry's car, and that is a part in this story that would plague Michelle's father for the rest of his life. And unfortunately, it wouldn't take long for the events of that night to go from bad to worse. Michelle's family were panic-stricken enough by Jason's sudden kidnapping, as it was, but it would only be a couple of hours for this story to take an even darker turn, and it would be a turn that none of them were able to truly recover from. Roughly 2 hours after Barry had stolen his child away from his in-laws' home, he would be dead. His car was the victim of a head-on collision that would leave his car a wreck, and Barry died at the age of 25 years old. First responders and investigators quickly searched the car wreck, hoping that they would find baby Jason alive, or at least find a clue that could point to where he was. But there was no one else in Barry's car, and no trace of Jason. This led to an intense and extensive search of the accident site and surrounding area. Investigators searched homes, hotels, the streets. They visited Barry's friends and his family, desperately trying to figure out what Barry could have done with the boy in only the few hours they had been missing together. But no one had any idea what had happened to Jason or where he was. And the city of Adelaide was experiencing a particularly bad storm that night, which further hindered the investigations and made it difficult to fully search the area. But the community and Jason's family continued to hold on to hope that the baby would be found alive. The leading theory at the time was that Barry had dropped his son off, either at his family home or with a friend, to keep him hidden from the police and from Michelle and her family. But with Barry's death, it was impossible for investigators to ask him exactly what he had done with his son. Searches of his family's homes revealed nothing, and none of them could give investigators any clues as to where they thought Barry would have taken Jason. And eventually, the theories on what had happened took a turn bleaker. By then, there had been extensive media coverage on the missing child, and Michelle, her family and friends, and the community were all actively searching for any sign of Jason, still desperately trying to bring him home, back to his mother. But this extensive media coverage led investigators to move away from the idea that someone Barry had known had Jason and was raising him as their own child now that Barry had died, possibly without even knowing who the boy really was, and investigators started looking at other possibilities. They looked at Barry's history of mental health issues, at his strange behaviour that day, and the fact that Jason was not actually in the car at the time of Barry's accident, and they decided that it was more than likely that in the few hours that they'd been missing together, Barry had murdered his son. Investigators then turned to look at the severe weather that the city had been experiencing that night, and they concluded that due to the severe weather conditions, the rain had actually covered up any evidence of Barry's crime, which then made it almost impossible for them to locate Jason. Their theory was that in the hours that Barry and Jason were alone, he'd killed the baby and possibly thrown his body into one of the nearby rivers, which were swollen with all of the extra rain from the storms, and carried the baby much further away than it would have under normal circumstances. They believed that this was why they hadn't been able to locate him or find even a single trace of him, and that was why absolutely no one seemed to know where Jason was. This was a theory that would haunt Michelle and her family for many years to come. Michelle later spoke in an interview with News Australia that her father had never been able to forgive himself for letting baby Jason slip away that evening, and she spoke about how difficult losing a child had made it for her to carry on with her life. She spoke about how it hadn't been an easy decision for her or for her parents when they all decided to move back to the UK to get a fresh start, and that, in so many ways, it felt as if she was abandoning her son. But she also spoke about how, to this day, she holds onto the hope that he is still out there somewhere, maybe without even knowing who he really is. In the almost 50 years that Jason has been missing, Michelle married once again and had another son, and even though her family has been a source of love and comfort, she's never quite recovered from the events that day. Jason's case remains open, including a reward that can be claimed by anyone able to provide information that leads to a break in the case. And if baby Jason, who would now be in his 50s, is out there and able to recognise his true identity, he would find a family who has held on to hope that they'll all be reunited one day. Quote, "I think any human being would have to have hope," Michelle said in her interview with Australian News, and she continues to hold on to that hope, both for herself and for her son's sake. As a baby, Darren Jason Shannon had blonde hair and blue eyes, and on the day that he went missing, he was wearing a long white nightgown and a blue button-up cardigan. These are things that possibly could have been kept as mementos if Jason had been raised in secret by someone else, and it's worth taking a look at if you know someone who may fit baby Jason's age range and description. We may never find out what really happened to the young boy that night. Some people may be inclined to believe the investigators' theories that Barry killed his son and disposed of his body right before his own accidental death, but others may put faith in a mother's hope to be reunited with her lost son, a son who was her first thought in the morning for decades after his disappearance.